The wind in our valley has a way of speaking. Some days it sighs, bending the prairie grass in lazy arcs. Some days it roars, a freight train barreling down from the Rockies. And some days, like the morning it brought her, it carries the kind of silence that means trouble is listening. I was on the porch, coffee steaming in a chipped mug Sarah bought at a flea market 20 years ago, when a white BMW appeared at the far bend of the dirt road. It didn't belong here. Everything in this valley wears dust like a badge of honor. That car gleamed like it had been waxed an hour ago, its tires crunching the gravel in neat, expensive rhythms. Voltage, my old shepherd mix, lifted his head from the sunny patch by my boots. One soft growl. He's a better judge of character than most men I know. I set my coffee down, the steam curling away in the chill. The BMW rolled to a stop at the end of my driveway. The driver's door opened, and Trouble stepped out, tall, tanned, heels designed for boardrooms, not dirt roads. Her hair was salon perfect, her sunglasses big enough to reflect half the valley, and her perfume, God help me, announced her arrival before she said a word. "Good morning," she called like we were old friends. I didn't answer right away. My father taught me silence makes people tell you more than they mean to. She crossed the last few yards with a clipboard tucked under one arm, trailed by two men in matching polo shirts, and the kind of nervous expressions you see on people who don't want to be somewhere. "You must be Mr. Riverside," she said brightly, offering a hand she clearly didn't expect me to take. "I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I just wanted to personally welcome you to the neighborhood and discuss a few matters regarding community compliance." Her voice had the practiced warmth of a real estate seminar, but her eyes flicked past me, scanning my workshop, my solar panels, the vegetable bed Sarah and I had planted long before the nearest McMansion was even a blueprint. I stepped down from the porch, slow. "Ma'am," I said, "I've lived here 35 years. Your neighborhood moved in, not me." The smile didn't falter, just tightened, the way a rope does when you start pulling on it. "Of course, which is why I'm here. We've noticed a few deviations from our architectural standards. Nothing major, but they do affect property values. Your solar panels, for instance, were installed before your development was even built," I finished. "And they're mine." Karen glanced at the men behind her. They shifted their weight like schoolboys caught holding a prank. She pulled a folder from her clipboard and held it out like a sheriff delivering a warrant. "This is just a notice of required adjustments. You have 30 days to comply or face daily fines." I didn't take the papers. "You might want to check your county records," I said. "This property isn't in your HOA." That was the first time I saw the real Karen. The smile dropped a fraction, just enough to show the steel underneath. "Legal loopholes," she said softly, "don't protect eyesores forever." Voltage stood then, a low rumble in his throat. I put a hand on his neck, feeling the steady muscle beneath the fur. "I'm not an eyesore," I said. "I'm a neighbor, the kind who minds his own business. You might try it." She didn't answer, just turned on those impractical heels and walked back toward her spotless car, the crunch of gravel underfoot suddenly deliberate. When the BMW disappeared over the hill, the wind picked up again, and I swear it carried the sound of a clock starting to tick. That night, the first message came. An envelope in my mailbox, printed on expensive letterhead. "Notice of violation. Failure to comply with community standards $500 monthly dues. Retroactive to 2019. Retroactive. To an HOA I'd never joined. I sat at my kitchen table, the lamplight pooling over the papers. Sarah's photograph, her laughing in the wind at the very edge of our property, watched from the windowsill. She told me once, during the hard months before the cancer took her, that people who can't control themselves will try to control everything else. I folded the notice, placed it in a drawer, and pulled out my original deed instead. The ink was faded, the paper soft at the edges, but the language was still clear. This parcel is exempt from all present and future homeowners associations. The county stamp was older than Karen's entire development. The next morning, I found them, 3 strangers with measuring tapes, pacing my fence line like they were sizing it up for auction. "You folks lost?" I asked. One of them muttered something about documenting violations. The tape flicked shut in his hands, the sound snapping across the prairie like a starter pistol. It was then I knew. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a siege. I've wired hospitals during blackouts and climbed power poles in blizzards. I know how to trace a problem back to its source. And now the source had a name, Karen Whitmore. Sarah always said I was too stubborn for my own good. I looked toward the horizon, where the new road cut through what used to be open land, and made a silent promise to her memory. If Karen wanted a fight over my home, she'd picked the wrong man. 2 mornings after the measuring tape incident, the valley woke with a sky the color of bruised steel. Rain hadn't touched us in weeks, but the air held that sharp, metallic taste that comes before storm. I was tightening a hinge on the barn door when the sound came, a slow, deliberate crunch of tires on gravel. Voltage barked once, low and warning, before trotting to the gate. It was a pickup this time, not the white BMW. County seal on the door. The man who stepped out wore a windbreaker zipped to the chin and carried a clipboard the way a rookie cop carries a gun. Unsure if he'll need it, but hoping he does. "Morning," he called, looking everywhere but at me. "Got a complaint here, structural violations and safety hazards." He didn't say who filed it. He didn't have to. I led him to the workshop, the same place Sarah and I had built together beam by beam. Inside, the smell of cedar and machine oil wrapped around us. My tools were lined up like soldiers, my solar battery system humming quiet and steady in its glass housing. The inspector checked each item, reading off serial numbers, jotting notes. His pen scratched to a stop. "These meet every code I've got on file, even the new ones. You pull permits for all this?" I tapped the corner of a faded folder on my workbench. Every single one, stamped and signed before Meadowbrook, was a gleam in a developer's eye. He blew out a breath. "Figures. I'll file a clean report. Sorry to waste your time." I walked him back to his truck. Over his shoulder, he muttered, "You've got a persistent neighbor. Watch your back." By noon, I understood what he meant. The Meadowbrook Estates Facebook group lit up with a thread titled, "Unsafe Structure on Adjacent Lot." What can we do? Karen's name wasn't on the post, but the photos were hers. I recognized the angle from where she'd stopped her BMW last week. She'd managed to make my property look like a junkyard, zooming in on lumber piles mid-project, cropping out the greenhouse, the gardens, the neat stacks of firewood. In the comments, strangers speculated about explosions, toxic runoff, and questionable characters hanging around. Questionable characters. That meant Mike, my old union buddy, who still wore his leather vest and carried himself like the biker he'd been in his 20s. I read until the taste of coffee in my mouth turned bitter, then shut the laptop. Sarah used to say online battles are like wrestling a pig. You both get muddy, and the pig likes it. That evening, Mrs. Henderson came by with oatmeal raisin cookies and a look I knew from my days on job sites. It's the look of someone deciding whether to tell you bad news. "She's been knocking on doors," she said finally, setting the cookies on my porch rail. "Talking about a petition. Says your solar panels are blinding drivers. Your workshop is a fire hazard, and your garden attracts pests." I told her she was out of her mind, but you should know, she's rallying people. I thanked her, and after she left, I stayed on the porch long after dark. The valley was quiet, the only light coming from my workshop windows and the scatter of stars above. That's when the first shadow moved along the fence line. At first I thought it was a coyote, but coyotes don't carry flashlights. The security cameras I'd set up years ago, just basic motion-activated units, caught the figures clearly. 2 men in Meadowbrook polo shirts, taking measurements, snapping photos, even trying to latch on my gate. They left after 10 minutes, but the message was clear. Karen was done with polite notices. The next day, I drove into town, straight to the county records office. The clerk, a woman with half-moon glasses and a talent for frowning without moving her mouth, brought me every file tied to my parcel. Deed from 1987, exempt. Survey maps, boundaries staked and photographed decades before Meadowbrook. Zoning document, agricultural, permanent. I made copies of everything. On my way out, I passed the community bulletin board by the diner. There it was, Karen's petition, printed in bold letters. Protect our community. Remove hazardous non-compliant structures. Half the signatures were from people I'd never met. A few were from folks I'd shared coffee with at Murphy's Diner for years. Betrayal burns slow, but it burns hot. That night, Mike stopped by. He listened while I told him everything. The inspector, the Facebook post, the petition, the trespassers. He didn't say much, just studied the glow of my solar lights across the yard. "Jake," he said finally, "you don't fight this head-on. You wire it like a circuit, trace the power, see where it fails. Then you cut it clean." Mike had been with me in blackouts, running cable through half-collapsed buildings. He knew what it took to keep the lights on when the grid failed. "We start with records," I said. "Then we follow the money." 2 weeks later, the first crack appeared. Buried in the county archives was a footnote on the Meadowbrook Incorporation papers. Legal descriptions of parcels under HOA authority, except one, flagged exempt, pre-existing private deed. My land. Some lawyer had copied the wrong language into the documents, never noticing that my property wasn't listed in the annexation map. Karen had been bluffing from day one. I could have gone to her right then, dropped the papers on her spotless hood, and ended it. But Sarah's voice was there, quiet but certain. "Don't just stop the bully. Show everyone what she is." So I waited. The wind returned the next afternoon, carrying the faint tang of asphalt from Meadowbrook's freshly paved streets. I stood at the porch rail, the file of documents under my arm, and watched Karen's BMW glide past. She didn't look my way, but her sunglasses tilted just enough to catch my reflection. She didn't know it yet, but the current she'd been trying to send my way was about to reverse. The wind changed on a Thursday. It came down from the mountains, sharp and cold, rattling the tin eaves of my workshop like impatient knuckles on a door. By noon, the sky had cleared to the kind of crystalline blue you only see after a storm has scraped everything clean. That's when Mike rolled up in his truck, the back weighed down with 2 heavy black cases. "Time to stop playing defense," he said. Inside the cases were cameras, serious ones. Military-grade lenses, motion sensors, infrared capability. If a squirrel sneezed near my property line, these would catch it. While we worked, drilling mounts into the corners of the workshop and barn, Mike told me about a contact of his, a retired municipal lawyer named Frank Lucas. 30 years tangling with bad city councils and worse HOAs. Mike said, "He's the guy who makes the rules bleed." Frank arrived the next day. Compact man, steel hair, and eyes like a hawk that had been watching for a very long time. He set his worn leather briefcase on my kitchen table and opened it like a doctor laying out instruments before surgery. "Let's start with what you've got," he said. By the time I'd spread the copies from the county, the petition flyers, the Facebook screenshots, and the HOA letters across the table, Frank was grinning. "They're bluffing, and they've been sloppy." Sloppy was an understatement. Frank pointed to the incorporation map where my parcel wasn't shaded in. "They have no jurisdiction. None. This isn't just a defense. This is leverage." That night, I stood in the doorway of the workshop, watching the camera's tiny indicator lights blink on. Voltage patrolled the perimeter, nose low to the ground, ears pricked. For the first time since Karen's BMW had pulled up my drive, I felt the coil in my chest loosen. Not relief, something harder. Resolve. The turn came 3 days later. I'd been in town picking up lumber when my phone buzzed. Motion alert from the new system. The preview image stopped me cold. Karen herself, halfway through my gate, flanked by 2 men in Meadowbrook polos. One was testing the latch on my barn. The other had a camera pressed to my workshop window. I pulled up a live feed. Karen glanced around, then leaned toward the glass, cupping her hands to peer inside. Every muscle in me wanted to drive home and end it there. But I remembered Sarah sitting across from me at that kitchen table during the chemo months, telling me that sometimes patience is the sharpest blade. So I stayed where I was, let the cameras roll, and let them dig their own hole. That footage became the heart of our first counterpunch. Frank drafted a letter, not a warning, but a demand for immediate cessation of trespassing, accompanied by still frames from the video. We sent it not just to Karen, but to every Meadowbrook board member, the county sheriff, and the local paper. By the next morning, the footage was on the front page. HOA president caught trespassing in property dispute. The comments under the article were split. Half the readers calling for Karen's resignation, the other half claiming the paper had it out for community leaders. But the most important shift wasn't online. It was in the parking lot of Murphy's Diner, where neighbors I barely knew started walking up to shake my hand. "She fined me for having a bird feeder," one man said. "She told my wife her garden was an affront to the neighborhood," another added. Karen hadn't just picked a fight with me. She'd been picking at everyone. That night, the valley didn't feel quite as quiet. Lights moved between houses. Groups stood in driveways, talking low and urgent. Mrs. Henderson came by again, not with cookies this time, but with a list, names, addresses, and stories. Each one a neighbor with their own Karen grievance. Mike spread the list on my workbench. "This," he said, tapping it, "is how you take her power. Not with lawyers alone, by showing everyone what she's really been doing." The emotional hit came a week later. I was walking back from the greenhouse when I saw them, a cluster of kids on the far edge of the Meadowbrook Road, staring toward my property. One of them, maybe 10 years old, called out, "Hey, are you the guy with the bomb batteries?" The other kids laughed. I froze. It wasn't the insult. It was hearing Sarah's greenhouse, her pride, her work, reduced to something ugly in a child's mouth. That's when the fight stopped being about just me. Frank agreed. Defamation's not just in print. It's what she's spreading, what's damaging your reputation. We added to the list. We were building a case now, not to survive her attacks, but to dismantle the whole machine she ran. Then the unexpected broke, everything open. Rebecca Torres, an investigative reporter from Denver Channel 7, called me after seeing the trespassing footage. "I've been tracking HOA abuse cases," she said. "Yours isn't just another petty dispute. It's a pattern. I like to come out, see your setup, talk on record." I hesitated. Sarah and I had always kept this place private, but the damage Karen had done thrived in the dark. Maybe it was time to turn on the lights. Rebecca spent a whole afternoon here, walking the gardens, filming the solar system, asking about Sarah. Her crew caught voltage curling up at my feet. The workshop door opened to the tools neatly hung on the wall. 2 nights later, the segment aired. The shots of my property looked nothing like Karen's Facebook photos. Viewers saw a man tending a piece of land with care, not a hazard zone. They heard my neighbors talk about years of harassment, not about community standards. The next morning, my inbox was full. From Colorado Springs, "How do I fight my HOA like you?" From Montana, "Can you share your lawyer's contact?" From a man in Florida, "They're trying to take my dock." Watching your story gave me hope. It wasn't just my fight anymore. That was the moment I knew we'd crossed into new territory. Karen's campaign had been about control, of me, of the neighborhood, of the narrative. But the cameras, the records, the neighbors, and now the media had shifted the current. I wasn't being pulled under anymore. I was pulling back, and she didn't see it coming. The first sign that Karen felt the shift came on a Monday morning. I opened my gate to find a certified letter tucked into the latch like a poisoned gift. Inside, notice of legal action. Petition to remove hazardous structures and collect damages. $35,000. Tear down the workshop. Remove the solar panels. Pay community restitution. Frank read it in my kitchen while sipping Sarah's old chipped mug like it belonged in his hand. He flipped the last page back onto the stack. "This isn't a case, Jake. It's theater. But that doesn't mean it can't hurt you if we let it play out on our stage." I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed. Then we build our own stage. That week, Murphy's Diner became our war room. Mike, Mrs. Henderson, Frank, Rebecca, and 3 other neighbors who'd had run-ins with Karen sat around the corner booth. The smell of frying bacon and burnt coffee filled the air while Frank laid out the plan. Step 1. Secure every piece of hard evidence: photos, video, financial records. He tapped my folder of county documents. Step 2. File counterclaims: harassment, defamation, trespassing, and malicious prosecution. Step 3. He smiled faintly. Step 3 is the public part. Rebecca's pen was already moving. "You want this to stick, you show them the pattern. Neighbors, businesses, past HOA members. Build a wall of testimony so tall she can't climb over it." Mrs. Henderson nodded. "You'll have more names by Friday." And we did. By the end of the week, my workbench was buried under signed statements. Gardeners fined for unapproved plantings, veterans cited for non-compliant flags, retirees written up for unsightly birdhouses. Each story was a brick in that wall. Mike and I spent evenings under the hum of the workshop lights, scanning every document, backing them up on encrypted drives. Voltage paced at the door, ears flicking toward every crunch of gravel outside. The pressure was mounting, but I felt something else too, a dangerous thing for a man in my position. Hope. Karen didn't take the change in momentum quietly. The following Tuesday, she showed up at the county zoning office while Frank and I were there filing motions. I caught sight of her through the glass door, heels clicking like rifle bolts, sunglasses hiding whatever was in her eyes. "Mr. Riverside," she said, voice syrupy for the benefit of the clerk. "Still making trouble?" Frank didn't even look up from the counter. "Still losing jurisdiction?" Her jaw tightened. "This isn't over." "No," I said. "It's not." We left her standing there in the echo of her own heels. 2 days later, retaliation hit from another angle. Bob Fletcher, who owned the hardware store, called me from behind his counter. "Jake, she was in here this morning. Told me if I didn't cut you off from buying supplies, she'd push for an HOA boycott." "What did you say?" "I told her you've been buying here 30 years. She's been here 2 minutes, and she can go pound sand." That loyalty meant more than I could say, but it also meant she was getting desperate enough to try cutting me off from the basics. Frank leaned over the diner table the next morning. "Desperation makes people sloppy. We keep pushing." Rebecca was already 1 step ahead. Her next piece aired that night. 10 minutes of interviews with neighbors, small business owners, even the county supervisor, all telling the same story. A president who used rules as weapons, fines as intimidation, and power as a personal hobby. The footage of Karen turning away from her own camera crew in a grocery store parking lot played twice. That's when she came at me with the dirtiest move yet. A sheriff's deputy knocked at my door just after sunrise. "We've had a complaint," he said. Allegations of verbal threats and aggressive behavior toward Ms. Whitmore. It was surreal, standing there in the cold, Voltage at my side, listening to a man I'd known 20 years read from a report full of lies. "Jake," he said finally, lowering the clipboard. "This is garbage, but I have to log it. You got any footage from those new cameras?" "Every second," I said. He left with a copy of the video from that morning's timestamp. Me splitting wood in the yard, not harassing anyone. By noon, Karen had a warning from the sheriff's office about filing false police reports. Frank smiled when I told him. Every misstep she makes now is going in front of the judge. The weeks blurred. Legal filings, interviews, community meetings. The Property Rights Defense Fund we'd set up online crossed $50,000. Letters came from all over the country. A rancher in Texas sent a check with a note that read, "Don't let the bastards win." It wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about proving that people like her couldn't keep using paper shields and petty rules to crush their neighbors. Still, the nights had a way of stripping the armor off. One evening, after everyone had left the workshop, I stayed alone, the only light coming from the desk lamp and the red blink of the security feed. Sarah's photo leaned against the wall above the bench. "I wish you could see this," I said to her smile. "It's working, but it's taking everything I've got." Voltage rested his head on my knee, the quiet weight of him grounding me. For a moment, I let the tiredness show, the ache in my shoulders, the knot in my chest that never fully loosened. We were close. I could feel it. But close meant the fight was about to get ugly in ways I hadn't yet seen. That ugliness arrived the next morning in a manila envelope from Frank. "Financial records," he said when I opened the door. "And you're going to want to sit down." Inside were bank statements, invoices, and scanned contracts. It didn't take long to see the pattern. HOA funds funneled to shell companies, payments to vendors who didn't exist, thousands spent on consulting with no work product. And every trail led back to Karen's personal accounts. "This isn't just harassment anymore," Frank said. "This is fraud. Federal level." Rebecca's eyes lit up when she saw it. "We go public with this, she's finished." "Not yet," Frank said. "We save it for the courtroom. Make the judge the first to see the whole picture. That way, there's no walking it back." The plan was set. In 2 weeks, we'd have our day in court. 2 weeks to gather the last testimonies, lock down the evidence, and make sure the wall we'd built was unshakable. Karen must have felt the ground slipping. She doubled her patrols, parked outside my gate for long stretches, sent more letters, each one shriller than the last. The night before the hearing, I stood on the porch watching her BMW crawl past in the dark. She didn't wave this time, didn't even look my way. Voltage pressed against my leg, his eyes on the taillights as they disappeared over the rise. "Almost done, boy," I said. The wind was still. The valley was quiet. But it was the quiet of a room where everyone's holding their breath, waiting for the gavel to fall. The courthouse in town was built in 1912, all red brick and brass fixtures worn smooth by a century of hands. On the morning of the hearing, its marble steps felt colder than the air, slick with a frost that hadn't yet burned off. The place was already buzzing, reporters with cameras slung around their necks, neighbors whispering in tight knots, a film crew from Denver unloading tripods. It wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was an event. Frank and I walked through the double doors without saying much. My case file was tucked under his arm like a weapon. Mike followed, scanning the hall with the wary eyes of someone who's been in too many bar fights. Mrs. Henderson was already inside, knitting needles, clicking quietly in the gallery like she was timing her stitches to the clock on the wall. Karen arrived late. When she stepped through the doors, the room changed. Conversations dropped a notch. The air thickened. She wore a charcoal skirt suit and pearls, but the sharp edges were dulled. Hair just slightly out of place, skin drawn tight around the eyes. Her lawyer, young enough to still smell of law school, carried her briefcase like it might explode. The judge, Morrison, took the bench at 9:01 sharp. His presence was the kind that didn't need to shout. The shuffle of papers in the gallery stopped dead. Case number 22 to 417, Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association versus Mr. Jake Riverside, he announced. Karen's lawyer went first. His voice trembled on the opening line. "Your Honor, the defendant has repeatedly..." "Counsel," Morrison cut in. "Before we go further, I'll need you to present evidence of the HOA's legal authority over the defendant's property." The young man swallowed, shuffling through a folder, pulling out maps and deeds. Pages slipped from his grip, skittering across the table. He recovered one and held it up. "We believe the property falls within. That's a belief," Morrison said. "Do you have proof?" Silence. The kind that eats a man from the inside out. "No, Your Honor," the lawyer admitted finally. Frank rose like a man stepping into familiar territory. "If it pleases the court, we do." He placed the original 1987 deed on the evidence table, county stamp and exemption clause glowing under the overhead lights. Then the survey maps, flag boundaries drawn years before Meadowbrook existed. "This property," Frank said, "was never, is not, and cannot be under the HOA's jurisdiction. And what's more, this association has engaged in a 3-year campaign of harassment, trespassing, defamation, and fraud against my client." He gestured to the monitor beside the bench. The first video clip filled the screen. Karen at my gate, flanked by 2 men, rattling the barn latch and peering through my workshop window. You could hear her voice through the camera's mic. "We'll see about that," the gallery murmured. The next clip, 2 men in Meadowbrook polos measuring my fence line without permission. Then came the still frames of Karen parked outside my property at night, phone in hand, taking pictures through the dark. Rebecca's photographs came next. The workshop neat and orderly, the gardens thriving, the panels gleaming in the sun, side by side with Karen's cropped, misleading images from Facebook. Frank didn't stop there. He shifted to the bank statements, invoices, and contracts we'd gathered, the shell companies, the payments to non-existent vendors, the consulting fees deposited straight into Karen's personal account. The total missing, $312,000. And then the gut punch. 3 forged signatures on the HOA incorporation documents, matched against signatures from the actual residents, all of whom had moved away before the HOA was formed. Gasps swept the room. Morrison leaned forward. "Ms. Whitmore, would you care to explain this?" Karen stood, gripping the table hard enough to whiten her knuckles. "These accusations are politically motivated. The defendant has been waging a smear campaign." "Ms. Whitmore," Morrison said, his voice flat as steel, "this court deals in evidence, not conspiracy theories." Then Marcus Littlefeather took the stand. He spoke quietly, but with the weight of 100 years behind him. He laid out the original Arapaho treaty maps, explaining how Meadowbrook sat on land with unresolved federal claims. Claims my property had been intentionally excluded from to avoid legal entanglements. You cannot exercise HOA authority over land you have no legal right to in the first place, he concluded. Morrison's pen scratched across the page. Duly noted. The climax came when Frank played the audio from the county inspector's hidden mic, Karen offering $5,000 cash to find safety violations in my solar setup. Her voice was unmistakable. In the gallery, someone whispered, "Oh, she's done." Karen snapped. "He's destroying our property values. That cabin is an eyesore, and that so-called workshop is a danger to every—" "Ms. Whitmore," Morrison barked, "sit down." "Now." She stayed standing, breathing fast, eyes darting to the gallery, to the cameras, to the clock on the wall, as if looking for an exit. The bailiff took a step forward. Finally, she sat. Morrison removed his glasses, folded them slowly, and set them on the bench. The silence stretched until you could hear the faint hum of the ceiling fans. "This," he said, "is the most egregious abuse of homeowners association authority I have seen in 30 years on the bench. Mr. Riverside's property was never subject to HOA governance. The incorporation documents contain forged signatures. The financial records reveal systematic embezzlement. The trespass and harassment are well documented and undeniable." He paused, looking directly at Karen. "You have not just overstepped your authority. You have weaponized it for personal gain." The gavel came down like a rifle shot. "I hereby dismiss all claims against Mr. Riverside with prejudice. I order the immediate dissolution of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA pending criminal investigation. Furthermore, I award the defendant $127,000 in damages and legal fees. This matter will be referred to the district attorney for prosecution." The sound that followed was unlike anything I'd heard in that room before. A mix of cheers, gasps, and the scrape of chairs as people stood. Karen said something to her lawyer, but it was lost under the swell of voices. The bailiff moved to escort her out. Outside, the sun had risen high and hard, throwing sharp light across the courthouse steps. Cameras and microphones closed in, neighbors clapped me on the back, strangers shook my hand. Through it all, I caught sight of Karen being helped into her BMW, head down, shoulders hunched. She didn't look back. For the first time in months, I took a breath that went all the way to the bottom of my lungs. It wasn't over. Not yet. The criminal case would come. The investigations would follow. But the weight that had pressed on my chest since the day her car first rolled up my drive was gone. The current had reversed completely. And this time, it was carrying me home 0.6 months after Judge Morrison's gavel ended the fight. The valley had settled into a different kind of quiet. Not the tense, watchful silence of waiting for the next blow. This was the hush of a house after the storm shutters come down, when the air smells of wet earth, and the only sound is the wind finding its old path again. I woke early most mornings, not because I had to, but because I wanted to see the way the sun broke across the prairie. Voltage would be there too, tail swaying, the old boards of the porch creaking under his weight. Sometimes I bring my coffee to the very edge of the property line and look toward Meadowbrook, where the white BMW used to cruise past. Now there were kids on bicycles. Where I'd once watched patrol cars pull up for false reports, there were pickup trucks hauling garden soil. Karen's house had been on the market for 3 months before the bank finally took it. She left in the dark, no goodbyes, no last stand, just a moving truck in the slow sweep of its taillights out of the valley. I heard she took a retail job in another state under her maiden name. Folks around here don't say her name much anymore. Not because they've forgotten, but because they filed it away where bad stories belong, somewhere you don't visit unless you need a reminder. The land healed in small ways first. The old HOA office, stripped of its authority, became the Meadowbrook Community Garden, built by volunteers, paid for with the same fundraising pot that once funded my legal defense. Kids now plant beans where stacks of violation letters used to sit. The artificial ponds, once trimmed to exacting aesthetic standards, grew reeds and cattails, drawing ducks and herons back for the first time in years. One Saturday, I stood with Mrs. Henderson by the water, watching her grandkids scatter breadcrumbs into the ripples. You know, she said, I used to think the HOA was what kept us together. Turns out it was what kept us apart. My workshop, Sarah's workshop, changed too. It became more than a place to fix and build. Frank comes by once a week to hold free legal clinics for homeowners in trouble. Rebecca films her series on property rights here now, interviewing families who fought back and won. Sometimes strangers drive in from counties away just to see the cabin that beat the HOA. I always tell them it wasn't the cabin that won. It was the people. In late spring, Lincoln Elementary sent a busload of fourth graders for a field trip. We walked the garden beds, toured the solar array, and let them take turns starting the windmill pump. One boy lingered after the others had gone back to the bus. He ran his hand along the workshop wall, tracing the grain of the cedar. Did you really almost lose all this? He asked. Yes, I said, but we fought for it. Why? I looked at him, thinking of Sarah, of the way she'd sit on this porch with a glass of iced tea and her hair pulled back, looking out at the land like it was a story she hadn't finished telling yet. Because some things, I said, aren't just yours. They're part of you. And if you don't fight for them, you stop being yourself. The fight had cost more than money. I'd spent nights pacing the floor, mornings waking up with that coil of dread in my chest, afternoons wondering if it would all be worth it. And yet, standing in the middle of the valley now, with neighbors planting, kids laughing, and voltage chasing grasshoppers, I knew the answer. It was worth every second. The last time I saw Karen was in a photograph. Rebecca had sent it to me. It was from a news piece about HOA reform bills passing in 3 states, laws modeled after our case. Karen's name was buried halfway down the article, mentioned only as a former HOA president convicted of embezzlement. The picture was grainy, taken outside a courthouse in another state. She looked smaller. The edges that once cut through rooms were gone. I stared at it for a long moment, then deleted it. Some storms aren't worth watching blow themselves out. In the evenings, the porch has become a gathering place again. Mike brings his guitar, Mrs. Henderson brings cookies, and someone always brings something from the garden. We sit until the fireflies come out, the laughter carrying into the dark. Every so often, someone will mention the bad old days, but only in passing, like you'd mention a drought you survived or a winter that froze the pipes. We've got better stories now. One night, after everyone had gone, I stayed on the porch a little longer. The moon was high, silvering the tops of the prairie grass. Voltage lay at my feet, warm and steady. I thought about Sarah, not in the sharp way I used to, but in a quiet way, like the sound of a familiar song drifting from another room. She'd always said, good people find each other when times get tough. I used to think she meant neighbors. Now I knew she meant something wider. People you've never met. People who live states away. People who only know you from a headline but still send you a check or a letter or a story of their own fight. That's the real current under all this. When the wind comes now, it carries no threat. It smells of cut hay, of rain moving in from the west, of gardens in bloom. And when I think about the 3 years Karen spent trying to bend this place into something it was never meant to be, I don't think of the anger anymore. I think of the moment in court when the gavel came down and the weight that had been pressing on all of us just lifted. It sounded like thunder breaking over the valley. It felt like a door swinging wide open. The night before the first anniversary of the hearing, I took Sarah's old mug down from the shelf, poured myself a coffee, and stood on the porch as the sun broke over the hills. From here, you can see the whole sweep of the valley, the gardens, the ponds, the roofs of houses no longer under watch. The kind of view you don't just look at, you keep. Voltage nudged my hand, and I scratched behind his ears. We're still here, I told him. The wind shifted just enough to move the prairie grass, and I could almost hear Sarah's voice in it. It said, good. Now make sure it stays that way.